My husband told me he was running late. But Evelyn Carter was standing 10 feet away watching him kiss her best friend. The ballroom at the Hale Foundation Gala shimmered in gold and glass, the kind of place where everything looked expensive and nothing felt real, where waiters moved like shadows and conversation stayed just low enough to sound polite, and Evelyn stood perfectly still near the edge of the bar, one hand resting lightly against the marble counter as if she had simply paused for a drink, not because her entire life had just shifted into something colder and sharper. Daniel Carter had his back. Partially turned, one arm angled in a way that was too familiar, too practiced, his hand resting at the small of Sophia Bennett's back as if it belonged there, and Sophia, her best friend for nearly 15 years, tilted her head slightly as she smiled at something he said before leaning in, the kind of movement that didn't ask permission because it had already happened many times before, and then they kissed, not rushed, not confused, but easy, quiet, certain, like a habit. Evelyn didn't gasp. Didn't step forward, didn't drop her glass, because her body had already decided something for her before her mind could catch up. It chose stillness, the kind that settles in the chest like ice, the kind that keeps everything contained, and for a moment the room didn't disappear, it sharpened, the clink of crystal, the low hum of a jazz trio somewhere behind the stage, the faint scent of citrus and perfume layered into the air, all of it pressing in while she watched the exact second Daniel didn't look guilty, didn't hesitate, didn't even glance around, and that was when it became clear this wasn't a mistake, this wasn't new. This wasn't something that had just begun tonight under soft lighting and expensive wine. Evelyn shifted her gaze slightly, not away from them but through them, noticing details she hadn't noticed before. The way Sophia's hand lingered on his sleeve, the way Daniel leaned closer without thinking, the quiet confidence of two people who believed they were unseen, and she took a single step forward, her heel barely making a sound against the polished floor. Her posture straight, controlled, almost calm, as if she were about to join them rather than confront them, and then a voice behind her. Low and steady, cut through everything without raising itself. Don't? It said, simple, firm, not a request but a correction, and Evelyn stopped without turning. Not because she was startled but because something in the tone suggested knowledge, not sympathy, and the man stepped slightly closer, just enough that she could hear him without anyone else noticing. If you walk over there now, he continued, you'll miss what they're actually doing. And for the first time since she had seen the kiss, Evelyn's attention shifted, not to him fully, but enough to register that this moment, this precise moment, might be only the surface of something else entirely, something already in motion long before she arrived. And she remained where she was, silent, composed, watching, because whatever was happening in that room had not reached its most important part yet. The man did not rush to explain himself, and that was the first thing Evelyn noticed. He simply stood beside her with the same quiet control she had chosen for herself, his gaze fixed not on her but on Daniel and Sophia across the room as if he had already seen this scene play out before, and in a way that felt unsettlingly precise he had. You are watching the wrong moment, he said calmly, his voice low enough to disappear into the hum of the gala. What matters is what happens next. And Evelyn did not respond right away. She kept her eyes forward, watching Daniel straighten slightly, adjusting his jacket as if nothing unusual had happened, while Sophia reached for her glass of champagne with a small, composed smile, the kind of expression that belonged in photographs and press releases, not in Betrayal. And that was when Evelyn saw it, the shift, subtle but unmistakable. Daniel slipped his hand into the inside pocket of his suit and pulled out a large envelope, not something romantic or careless but structured, deliberate, the kind of envelope used for documents that carry weight, and he placed it on the table between them with a movement that was almost businesslike. Sophia did not hesitate. She opened her clutch and took out a thin folder, smooth, professional, and set it in front of him. Their conversation continued quietly, their heads leaning closer, but now it was different, not intimate, not personal, controlled, calculated, and Evelyn felt something inside her settle even further, not anger, not yet, just clarity sharpening into something more dangerous than emotion. Beside her, the man spoke again. That is not an affair, he said almost thoughtfully. That is a transaction. And this time Evelyn turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him without fully breaking her composure. He was in his early 60s, well-dressed but not flashy, the kind of presence that did not demand attention but always received it anyway. His expression was not sympathetic, it was certain, as if he had already confirmed something she had just begun to understand. Who are you? Evelyn asked quietly, her tone steady, and he gave a faint nod, not quite a smile, Jonathan Hale, he said. And unfortunately, I know exactly what you are looking at. Evelyn's eyes flicked back to Daniel just in time to see him open the folder, his posture tightening for a brief second before relaxing again, and then he slipped the contents into his jacket with a quick, practiced motion. He glanced around the room once, not nervously but carefully, like someone checking a final detail, and then he leaned closer to Sophia, saying something that made her nod once, slow and satisfied. How long? Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a breath. Jonathan did not answer immediately. He let a second pass, as if measuring what to reveal, and when, long enough, he said finally. And not just them. Evelyn felt that word land heavier than anything else that had happened so far. Not just them. Meaning this was larger, wider, planned. She shifted her weight slightly, her heels steady against the floor, her posture unchanged, but inside something had already begun to move, pieces aligning, questions forming faster than she could organize them. Daniel had been distant for months, late meetings, unexplained travel, sudden decisions about company structure that he had brushed off as routine, and Sophia had been there through all of it, offering support, advice, presence, always just close enough to feel helpful, never close enough to seem suspicious until now. You think this is about your marriage, Jonathan continued quietly, but it is not. Evelyn did not interrupt, she simply listened, her silence no longer empty but intentional. This is about removal, he added, and for the first time Evelyn's gaze shifted fully away from Daniel and landed on Jonathan, not startled, not afraid, but focused. Removal. From what? She asked, and Jonathan looked back toward the table where Daniel now stood, adjusting his cufflinks as if preparing for something else entirely, something beyond this quiet exchange. Everything, Jonathan said. And you are about to see how they plan to do it. And across the room, a staff member approached the stage, adjusting the microphone, the soft feedback barely noticeable over the music, but enough to signal a transition, something official, something public, and Daniel began to move, not toward Evelyn, not toward the exit, but toward the center of the room, and Sophia followed just half a step behind, perfectly aligned, and Jonathan's voice lowered even further, almost to a whisper. Stay exactly where you are, he said. Because the next part was designed for you whether you knew it or not. And Evelyn did not move, she did not speak. She simply watched as the room slowly began to shift its attention toward the stage, toward Daniel, toward whatever was about to be revealed. And for the first time that night, she understood that the moment she thought was the worst thing she could see had only been the beginning. The music softened just slightly as the host stepped up to the microphone, a subtle shift that most people would not notice unless they were already paying attention. And Evelyn noticed everything now, every movement, every glance, every calculated step as Daniel Carter moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, shaking hands, offering polite smiles, the perfect image of a composed executive, while Sophia remained just behind him, close enough to be associated, distant enough to appear appropriate. And if someone had walked into the room at that moment without context, they would have seen nothing unusual, just another successful couple navigating a formal evening. And that realization settled heavily into Evelyn's chest, not as pain but as understanding. This was not impulsive, this was staged, rehearsed, timed. Jonathan Hale did not move beside her, his posture relaxed, his attention fixed on the stage as if he had already seen the script unfold. Watch his hands, he said quietly, and Evelyn did. Daniel adjusted his cuff again, a small, precise motion, then reached briefly toward his jacket where the envelope and folder now rested, as if confirming they were still there, still secure, and then he stepped up onto the stage, accepting the microphone with a polite nod, the kind that suggested humility without actually surrendering control. Good evening, everyone, Daniel began, his voice smooth, practiced, carrying easily across the room without strain, and a ripple of attentive silence moved through the crowd, conversations fading, glasses lowering, all eyes shifting toward him, and Evelyn remained where she was, her expression unchanged, her body still. But her mind was moving quickly now, assembling fragments into something coherent, something dangerous. Tonight is not just about celebration, Daniel continued. It is about transition. And that word landed differently for Evelyn than it did for the rest of the room. She felt it, not as a speech line but as a signal, and beside her Jonathan exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly. There it is, he murmured, and Daniel went on, speaking about growth, about evolution, about the importance of leadership adapting to new opportunities, the kind of language that sounded impressive but revealed nothing specific until it did. As part of that transition, Daniel said, pausing just long enough to draw focus. We will be restructuring ownership within Carter Holdings. And there it was, clear enough for anyone listening closely, but vague enough to remain unchallenged in the moment, and Evelyn felt the final piece click into place, not just an affair, not just betrayal but removal, systematic and clean. Sophia stepped slightly closer to the stage now, standing just off to the side, her posture composed, her expression supportive, and Daniel glanced toward her briefly, not long enough to raise suspicion, but long enough for Evelyn to recognize the alignment, the partnership, the certainty between them. Effective immediately, Daniel continued. New leadership appointments will be recognized, reflecting the direction we believe is necessary for long-term success. And a few people in the audience began to nod, some even smiling, interpreting this as progress, as ambition, as something positive, while Evelyn stood in silence, understanding exactly what it meant for her. Her name was not mentioned, not yet, but that omission was not an oversight, it was intentional, it was preparation. He is going to do it without saying your name first, Jonathan said quietly. He is going to define the future before he acknowledges the past. Evelyn did not respond. She did not need to, she could see it unfolding. Daniel was creating a narrative, one where she simply did not exist anymore, one where her absence would feel natural, justified, inevitable, and that was when the host shifted slightly beside Daniel, handing him a small card, a cue, a transition point, and Daniel's expression changed just enough to signal something more personal, something directed. And of course, he said, his tone softening just slightly, none of this would be possible without the support of those who have been part of this journey. A pause, carefully measured, the kind that pulls attention tighter, and Evelyn felt it, not as anticipation but as recognition. This was the moment Jonathan had warned about, the moment designed for her, whether she had known it or not, and the room seemed to hold its breath as Daniel looked out over the crowd, scanning faces, calculating, and then the microphone picked up the next words clearly, deliberately, as his gaze stopped in her direction, and Evelyn did not move, did not react, did not even shift her weight. She simply stood there, calm, composed, exactly where she had been told to remain, because now she understood something Daniel did not. This moment was not only his stage, it was hers as well, and he did not know it yet. Daniel Carter let the silence stretch just a second longer than necessary, the kind of pause that makes people lean in without realizing it, and then he smiled, not warmly, not genuinely, but with the controlled confidence of someone who believed he was about to close something cleanly. Evelyn, he said into the microphone, her name carried clearly across the ballroom, smooth and deliberate, and a subtle shift moved through the crowd as heads turned, searching, locating her, and just like that, the room that had felt distant a moment ago was now focused entirely in her direction. But Evelyn did not flinch, she did not step forward, she did not acknowledge the attention in any visible way. She simply stood where she was, her posture steady, her expression composed, as if being called out in a room full of executives and investors was the most ordinary thing in the world. Beside her, Jonathan Hale remained still, his presence unchanged, but there was a slight tightening at the corner of his eyes, not concern, not surprise, just confirmation. Here it comes, he said quietly, and on stage, Daniel continued. For years, Evelyn has been part of this company's foundation. His tone respectful, measured, carefully constructed, and her contributions have been appreciated. And to anyone else, it sounded like acknowledgement, like gratitude, but to Evelyn, it sounded like distance, like something being closed, archived, prepared for removal, because Daniel was not looking at her the way someone looks at a partner. He was looking at her the way someone references history, something that had already ended before the announcement was made. Sophia stood just off to the side, her hands lightly clasped in front of her, her expression soft, supportive, almost sympathetic, the kind of expression that would look appropriate in photographs, and Evelyn noticed that too, the positioning, the optics, the silent alignment, everything about this moment had been arranged to appear reasonable, inevitable, clean. However, Daniel said, and the word landed exactly where it was meant to, drawing a quiet tension through the room, as we move forward, it is important that leadership reflects the direction we are taking. And there it was, the shift from past to future, from inclusion to exclusion, spoken without accusation, without conflict, just a calm, professional transition, and Evelyn understood the precision of it. This was how you remove someone publicly without appearing to attack them. You thank them, you acknowledge them, and then you replace them, all in the same breath. Jonathan's voice came again, low, steady. He is framing you out, he said. making it look like evolution, not removal. And Evelyn did not respond because she could already see the next step forming. Daniel reached into his jacket once more, pulling out a document this time. Not the envelope, not the folder, but something else, something prepared for presentation, and he held it lightly in one hand as he continued. Effective tonight, we are formalizing a transition in ownership and executive authority. The words were smooth, practiced, designed to sound routine, but Evelyn felt their weight clearly. Ownership. Authority, those were not small adjustments, those were foundations, and Daniel was standing on stage redefining them in real time. A few people in the audience began to nod again, some even exchanging approving glances, interpreting this as progress, as strategic movement, and Sophia took a small step closer to the stage, just enough to be seen more clearly now, her presence no longer background but part of the picture, and Daniel's eyes flicked toward her for a fraction of a second before returning to the audience, and that single glance said everything Evelyn needed to know. And with that, Daniel said, lifting the document slightly, I would like to introduce the individual who will be stepping into this new role. Another pause, carefully placed, another moment designed to build anticipation, and Evelyn could feel the room leaning forward again, waiting, expecting something impressive, something aligned with the narrative he had been building. And beside her, Jonathan spoke one more time, quieter than before. This is where he replaces you, he said, not as a warning but as a fact, and Evelyn remained exactly where she was, calm, silent, watching, because Daniel still believed he was in control of this moment. He believed the stage belonged to him, that the story was his to define, and that was his first real mistake. Daniel Carter let the final pause settle over the room before he spoke again. His expression composed, confident, the kind of certainty that comes from believing the outcome has already been secured. Sophia Bennett, he said, turning slightly as he extended one hand toward her, will be stepping into this role moving forward. And the shift in the room was immediate, subtle but undeniable, a ripple of approval, curiosity and quiet surprise, heads turning, eyes following as Sophia stepped forward with calm precision, her posture flawless, her smile measured, neither too proud nor too modest, exactly what the moment required. And Evelyn watched it all without moving, without reacting, her gaze steady, her breathing even, because nothing Daniel had just said surprised her anymore. Not after what she had already seen, not after what she now understood. Sophia reached the stage and accepted the space beside Daniel as if it had always been hers, not newly given but rightfully claimed. And Daniel angled his body slightly toward her, aligning himself visually, reinforcing the narrative without needing to say another word. And for a moment, the two of them stood there together, framed perfectly under the warm lights. A new partnership presented as progress, as evolution, as something the room should accept without question, and many of them did. A few polite claps beginning near the front, spreading lightly through the audience, not loud, not overwhelming, but enough to signal approval. Beside Evelyn, Jonathan Hale exhaled slowly. There it is, he said, his voice quiet but certain. Transfer of authority, repositioning of control and public confirmation, all in one move. And Evelyn remained silent, her attention fixed on the stage, not on Sophia, not even on Daniel, but on the structure of what had just happened, the sequence, the timing, the execution, because this was not about emotion anymore, it was about design, and Daniel had just revealed more than he intended. On stage, Sophia leaned slightly toward the microphone, not taking it, not interrupting, but acknowledging the moment with a small nod. Her voice calm when she finally spoke. I am honored to be part of what comes next, she said, her tone steady, professional, carefully neutral, and the room responded with another wave of polite applause, stronger this time, more certain, and Evelyn noticed how easily Sophia fit into the role, how naturally she occupied the space that had just been created, as if the transition had been happening long before tonight. Daniel placed a hand lightly against Sophia's back, a gesture that appeared supportive, appropriate. But Evelyn recognized the truth behind it, ownership, alignment, control, and she did not look away, she did not break her focus, because the most important part of this moment was not what they were saying, it was what they believed, and Daniel believed this was finished, that the transition was complete, that Evelyn had already been removed from the equation in every way that mattered. Watch the audience, Jonathan murmured, and Evelyn did, investors nodding, board members exchanging brief looks of approval, a few quiet smiles, no resistance, no visible concern. The narrative had landed exactly as intended, clean, reasonable, justified. And that was the second mistake Daniel had made. He had assumed the room would not question the story, that no one would look deeper than what was presented on stage. Daniel lifted the document again, holding it slightly higher now. Formal documentation has already been prepared, he said, and will be finalized tonight. And that line moved through Evelyn like a precise confirmation, not just intention but execution. Papers signed, ownership shifted, control reassigned, all arranged in advance, all timed to unfold publicly, making reversal appear unlikely, unnecessary. Sophia nodded once beside him, her expression unchanged, composed, assured, and Daniel's gaze swept the room again, satisfied, confident, and then, just for a brief second, his eyes returned to Evelyn, not searching, not uncertain, but acknowledging, as if to say, this was done, this was decided. And Evelyn met that look without flinching, without anger, without any visible reaction at all, because in that exact moment, she understood something Daniel did not, something he had overlooked entirely, something hidden in the very structure he believed protected him, and she did not need to speak, did not need to move, because the truth was already there, waiting, and Daniel had just placed it directly into the spotlight himself. The applause faded into a softer hum of conversation as Daniel lowered the document slightly, his posture relaxed, satisfied, the way a man stands when he believes the outcome is already sealed, and for a few seconds nothing challenged him, nothing interrupted the narrative he had just built. The room accepted it, processed it, moved forward with it, and that was exactly what he had counted on. Evelyn remained where she was, her hands still, her expression composed, her presence almost invisible in a room that had just been directed away from her. But inside, everything had shifted from observation to decision, not emotional, not reactive but precise, because now she knew exactly what had been taken and, more importantly, how it had been taken, and that meant she knew where it could break. Beside her, Jonathan Hale glanced briefly in her direction, not asking, not advising, just measuring, as if he were waiting to see whether she would step into the moment or let it pass. And Evelyn did not move right away. She let the silence stretch just long enough to feel natural, just long enough for Daniel to settle deeper into his confidence, and then without urgency, without hesitation, she began to walk. Her heels made a soft, steady rhythm against the polished floor, not loud, not dramatic, just present. And it took a second before the nearest guests noticed, a few heads turning, subtle at first, then more. The motion of one person moving with purpose in a room that had just been told where to look, and Evelyn did not look at them, did not acknowledge the shifting attention. Her gaze remained forward, fixed on the stage, on Daniel, on Sophia, and on the structure of the moment itself. Jonathan did not follow, he stayed exactly where he was, his expression unchanged. But there was the faintest trace of something new in his posture, something closer to expectation, as if he had just seen the first move in a game he already understood. On stage, Daniel was speaking again, transitioning smoothly into the next part of the evening, thanking sponsors, acknowledging partners, continuing the script as if nothing else needed to be addressed, and Sophia stood beside him, composed, aligned, fully integrated into the role she had just been given, and neither of them noticed Evelyn immediately, because they were not looking for her. They had already placed her in the past, already removed her from the present, and that was their third mistake. Evelyn reached the edge of the stage and stopped, not stepping up, not interrupting, just standing there, close enough to be seen, not yet acknowledged, and she waited, not for permission, not for recognition, but for the exact right second, the moment when Daniel's sentence would naturally end, when the room would take a breath, when attention would loosen just enough to be redirected. And when that moment came, she did not raise her voice, she did not force the interruption, she simply spoke, calm, clear, controlled. "Daniel," she said, and the single word carried farther than it should have, not because it was loud, but because it was unexpected, because it did not fit the narrative that had just been presented. The room shifted again, sharper this time, attention snapping back toward the stage, toward her, toward the disruption that should not have been there, and Daniel paused, just for a fraction of a second, a break in rhythm so small most people would miss it, but Evelyn saw it, and so did Jonathan from across the room. Daniel turned slowly, his expression adjusting almost instantly, composed again, controlled, but there was something new beneath it now, something thinner, something less certain. "Evelyn," he said, his tone even, measured, as if this were expected, as if this were part of the plan, but his eyes told a different story. They were calculating now, reassessing, trying to understand what she was about to do. Evelyn did not step onto the stage, she did not need to, she stood exactly where she was, grounded, steady, her presence enough to hold the room, and she looked at him not with anger, not with hurt, but with clarity, the kind that comes when nothing is hidden anymore, and she spoke again just as calm as before. You said the documents were already prepared. And there was no accusation in her voice, no emotion at all, just a statement, a reference, and Daniel nodded slightly, cautious now. Yes, he replied, careful, controlled. They are? And Evelyn gave the smallest acknowledgement, a single, almost imperceptible nod, and then she said, good. And that was when the room began to realize something was wrong, because that was not the response anyone expected, not from someone who had just been publicly replaced, not from someone who was supposed to be removed quietly, and Daniel saw it too, the shift, the fracture in the narrative, and for the first time that night, he did not know what came next. Daniel did not move immediately, and that was the first visible crack, not in his posture, not in his words, but in the timing, because he had always been precise with timing, always one step ahead, always controlling the pace of every room he entered, and now, for the first time that night, he was reacting instead of leading, and Evelyn saw it clearly. The room held its breath in a quiet, collective pause, the kind that settles when something unexpected interrupts a polished narrative, and all eyes remained fixed on the space between them, the stage above, Evelyn below, the balance of power shifting without anyone fully understanding how. Sophia glanced toward Daniel just briefly, her expression still composed but no longer effortless. There was a question there now, small but present, and Daniel answered it with the slightest turn of his head, a signal to remain still, to stay aligned, to let him handle this, and then he stepped closer to the edge of the stage, adjusting the microphone slightly as if to reclaim control of the moment. Evelyn, he said again, his tone measured, calm. If you would like, we can discuss this privately after the event. And there it was, the attempt to contain, to move the disruption out of the public space, to return the room to the script he had prepared. But Evelyn did not accept the redirection, she did not step back, she did not lower her gaze. She simply looked at him with the same steady clarity. And for a second longer than expected, she said nothing, allowing the weight of his suggestion to settle, allowing the audience to hear it, to process it, to recognize what it implied, and then she spoke just as calmly as before. There is nothing private about what you just did. And the sentence did not rise, did not sharpen, it stayed even, controlled, and because of that, it carried further, deeper, settling into the room in a way raised voices never could. A subtle murmur moved through the audience, quiet but undeniable, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to signal that the narrative had shifted again, and Daniel felt it. The room was no longer fully with him, it was listening, watching, waiting, and that was not what he had planned. He tightened his grip slightly on the document in his hand, not visibly enough to draw attention, but enough for Evelyn to notice, and he responded carefully. This is a professional transition, he said, each word chosen, controlled. And I have acknowledged your contributions appropriately. And again, to anyone not paying attention, it sounded reasonable, respectful even. But Evelyn was not listening to the surface anymore. She was listening to the structure beneath it, the framing, the omission, the quiet removal. She tilted her head just slightly, not in confusion but in consideration, as if evaluating his statement rather than reacting to it, and then she said, "You mentioned the documents were finalized." And Daniel nodded once, slower this time, more cautious. "Yes," he replied, and Evelyn let a small pause follow, just long enough for the room to lean in again, for the attention to tighten, and then she added, "Then you already know what they say." And the sentence landed differently, not confrontational, not emotional but precise, and for the first time Daniel's expression shifted in a way he could not fully control, not dramatic, not obvious, just a flicker, a moment where certainty gave way to calculation, because that was not the direction he expected. Sophia's posture changed slightly beside him, not stepping back, not breaking alignment but adjusting, her composure now more deliberate than natural, and the audience felt it too, the subtle tension building. The sense that something had been overlooked, something not accounted for in the clean transition they had just been shown. From across the room, Jonathan Hale watched without moving, his eyes steady, focused, as if he were observing a process unfold exactly as it should, not intervening, not assisting, simply allowing the truth to surface at its own pace. Daniel inhaled quietly, recalibrating, preparing to respond, but Evelyn spoke again before he could fully regain control, her voice still calm, still level. "So you also know whose name is still on them." And that was the moment the room shifted for the third time, sharper, deeper, because now the implication was clear, not emotional, not personal but structural, legal, real, and Daniel understood it immediately, even before he responded, even before he moved. He understood that whatever he believed had been Completed might not be as final as he thought, and that realization, small as it was enough to change everything. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt heavy, deliberate, as if the room itself understood that something had just shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be smoothed over with polished language or controlled tone. And Daniel Carter felt it, not as panic, not yet, but as resistance, subtle and growing, the kind that does not come from noise but from doubt, and doubt spreads quietly. He adjusted his stance slightly, repositioning his weight, regaining his balance, because this was still his stage, his room, his narrative, and he was not ready to surrender it. Evelyn, he said again, more carefully now, each word measured. The documents have been reviewed and approved by legal counsel, and that line was meant to close the gap, to reinforce authority, to signal that everything had already been secured, finalized beyond challenge, and a few people in the audience nodded instinctively, reassured by the mention of legality, structure, process. But Evelyn did not move, did not react, she simply listened, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, and when Daniel finished, she gave the smallest acknowledgement, a slight incline of her head, as if accepting that statement at face value, and then she spoke, her voice calm, precise. "Of course they were," she said, and the simplicity of it made the room lean in again, because it did not resist, it did not argue. It did something far more unsettling, it agreed. Daniel hesitated, just briefly, because agreement was not what he expected, and that hesitation, small as it was, opened the space for Evelyn to continue. "You have always preferred things to look complete before they actually are," she added, still calm, still controlled, and a few people in the room shifted slightly, not fully understanding but sensing that something underneath the conversation was being revealed. Sophia's posture tightened almost imperceptibly beside Daniel, her composure still intact but no longer effortless, and her eyes moved quickly between them, calculating, reassessing, because this was no longer the clean transition she had stepped into moments ago. Daniel's voice came again, lower this time, more focused. "If you have a concern, this is not the appropriate setting," he said, attempting once more to contain the moment, to guide it back into private channels, but Evelyn did not acknowledge the suggestion. She did not follow his direction, she simply held her ground, and then she said, "You are right." And again agreement, again that same calm acceptance that did not align with the situation, and it unsettled the room more than resistance would have, because agreement meant control, and control meant intention. "This is not the appropriate setting," she repeated softly, "for incomplete information." And that was when the shift deepened, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. A quiet tightening across the room as people began to sense that something had been left out, something important, something structural. Daniel's grip on the document in his hand became firmer, still controlled, still subtle, but no longer relaxed, and he responded carefully. "There is nothing incomplete about this," he said, his tone steady, but the certainty now carried effort, not ease, and Evelyn watched him for a moment, not long, just enough to confirm what she already knew. And then she spoke again, her voice as even as it had been from the beginning. "Then you will not mind if I clarify one detail." And she did not wait for permission, she did not pause for approval, because this was not a request, it was a statement, and the room felt it immediately, the shift from response to control. She turned slightly, not toward Daniel, not toward Sophia, but toward the audience, the investors, the board members, the people who had just accepted the narrative without question, and she did not raise her voice. She did not need to, the room was already listening, fully now, completely. "The ownership structure of Carter Holdings," she said, "requires 2 active signatories for any transfer of executive authority." And the sentence landed cleanly, clearly, without emotion, without accusation, just fact, and the effect was immediate. Subtle but sharp. A ripple of awareness moving through the audience as people began to process what that meant. Daniel did not interrupt, not immediately, because he understood the implication the moment she said it. He understood where she was going, and more importantly, he understood that she was correct. Evelyn continued, her tone unchanged. "You have one," she said, looking at him now, not aggressively, not challengingly, just directly. "But you do not have the other." And that was when the room shifted completely. Not just attention, not just curiosity, but alignment, because now there was a question, real, concrete, undeniable. And it was no longer about perception, it was about structure, legality, reality. Sophia's composure faltered for the first time, not dramatically, not enough for everyone to see, but enough for Evelyn to notice, a slight tightening in her expression, a flicker of uncertainty, and Daniel remained still, his silence longer now, heavier, because there was no immediate way to redirect this, no simple line to smooth it over. Evelyn let the moment hold just long enough for the weight of it to settle, for the room to fully absorb what had just been revealed, and then she added quietly, precisely, "And my name is still on that line." And that was the moment everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because the narrative Daniel had built no longer held, and he knew it. For a few seconds no one spoke, and that silence carried more weight than anything that had been said all evening, because it was no longer polite, no longer controlled, it was real, and Daniel Carter felt it settle across the room like a shift in pressure, subtle but impossible to ignore. His hand remained on the document, but now it no longer looked like control, it looked like something he was holding on to, something that had just lost its certainty. And his eyes stayed on Evelyn, searching, calculating, trying to find a way back into the narrative he had constructed so carefully. But there was no immediate path, because she had not attacked him, she had not accused him, she had simply revealed a fact he could not deny. A quiet murmur moved through the audience, no longer contained, no longer subtle, people leaning toward each other, exchanging quick, low comments, the kind that do not need to be heard to be understood, because once a structure is questioned, it does not return to the original form, it fractures and everyone can see the lines. Sophia Bennett stood beside Daniel, still composed, still upright, but the ease was gone now, replaced by something tighter, more deliberate, her eyes no longer scanning the room with quiet confidence but fixed forward, focused, as if holding her position required effort, and for the first time, she did not look like the future being introduced. She looked like someone waiting to see if that future would hold. Daniel inhaled slowly, steadying himself, and when he spoke again, his voice was still controlled, but the tone had changed, less assured, more careful. "Evelyn," he said, "those documents reflect a transition that has been in progress for some time." And it was a good line, measured, strategic, designed to imply continuity, inevitability, but it did not answer the question, and everyone in the room could feel that. Evelyn did not interrupt him. She let the sentence settle, she gave it space, and then she responded, just as calmly as before. "That is true," she said, and again agreement, again that same controlled acknowledgement that refused to escalate, and because of that, it held more power than contradiction ever could. "It has been in progress," she continued, "but not completed." And the distinction landed cleanly, clearly, impossible to ignore, and Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough for Evelyn to see. She took one small step forward, not onto the stage, but closer, reducing the distance just enough to shift the visual balance, and the room followed that movement instinctively, attention tightening again, fully focused now, completely aligned with her. "You prepared the documents," she said, her voice steady. "You arranged the timing, you structured the announcement. Each phrase deliberate, not rushed, not emotional, just a sequence of facts, but you presented them as final before they were legally binding." And that was the point where the room fully understood, not just the implication but the reality, because this was no longer about perception, it was about accuracy, and accuracy carries weight in rooms like this. Daniel's response did not come immediately this time, and that delay, that absence of immediate control, was louder than anything he could have said, because it confirmed what Evelyn had just revealed, and in that confirmation, the narrative shifted completely. From across the room, Jonathan Hale watched without moving, his expression unchanged, but there was something in his gaze now that resembled quiet approval, not for the outcome, but for the precision of how it had been reached, because Evelyn had not disrupted the room, she had redirected it. Sophia's posture shifted again, subtle but undeniable, her alignment with Daniel no longer seamless, her presence no longer reinforcing his position but standing beside it, separate, and that separation, small as it was, changed the entire picture. Evelyn let the silence settle one more time, just long enough for the weight of everything to land fully, and then she said, "So nothing changes tonight." And the sentence was simple, almost understated, but it carried the finality of a conclusion, not loud, not dramatic, just clear, and Daniel understood it immediately, even before he responded, even before he moved. He understood that whatever he believed he had secured had not been secured at all. She did not raise her voice, did not look around for validation, did not seek agreement from the audience because she did not need it. The structure spoke for itself, the truth held on its own, and that was the difference. Daniel had built a narrative, Evelyn had revealed a reality, and in a room like this, reality always wins. She stepped back then, just one step, returning to her original position, not claiming the stage, not taking more than she needed, because the moment had already shifted. The balance had already changed, and there was nothing left to prove. And as the room slowly began to process what had just happened, as conversations restarted in quieter, more cautious tones, as Daniel stood on stage holding a document that no longer carried the weight he intended, one thing had become unmistakably clear: the real transition had not been the one he announced, it was the one he never saw coming, and it had already begun.